Hey there, Russ here. Welcome back to the shop. Okay, I want to talk about fogs again. Forced off-grid survival. Been talking about fogs for several years now. But I think that even after Helena, and I really feel for those people there, and I hope it gets better. It's a horrible thing to see. But anyway, it taught me a lot. Got me to thinking a lot about how you would handle that if you did lose your power for any length of time, whether it's for 2 hours, for 24 hours, or for days, or even longer. What kind of scenario can you fall back on to be able to survive? Now, if you're like most people here in the United States, most of us have refrigerators, and a good part of the people also have at least one other device like that, either a second refrigerator or a deep freezer, or maybe even both, and maybe even more than one. What your needs are, it varies from person to person, but what's in those refrigerators and freezers is what's important. Without power, you're going to lose a ton of money, I suspect. So it's worthwhile to have some kind of investment to help protect that investment. With that in mind, I don't care about going off grid or supplying power back to the power company to cut my bill. None of that is of concern to me, but I gotta have the power when I gotta have it. So that means that the system that I want to back up to protect myself when power goes down is a lot different than off-gridders or people that want to supply power back to the grid to try to save money. First, I want to talk about, it's going to vary what you need based on who you are and what you use in the way of power. But everybody talks about, oh, I got to go out and buy this size, and they base what they buy more on the price and how much money they're spending, and they think they can get by. But really what you should do is really calculate out what it is that you need in the way of power consumption. And that all starts with, you really need to know how many watts you use in your home on a daily basis. I've been looking at my power bills for probably 3 years now, and I have a pretty good idea of what I use and what time of year I'm using it, how much gas I use, and how much electricity. Now, I happen to be fortunate because I have natural gas for some of my appliances, like the hot water heater, the furnace, cooking, even though I have some electrical appliances for cooking, and I use those because they're much more convenient in some scenarios. But if the power goes out, I could live without those pieces of equipment and use just my oven and my stove to do all the cooking. And that would cut down my power consumption a notable amount. So you have to understand, before you decide what kind of unit you want for a home backup, you got to first understand how many watts you're going to need. If the power goes out and you want to get by in the bare minimum, then let's say you just want to do a refrigerator and a few lights, and that's it till the power comes on. Okay, maybe the TV. So you figure out that you're using 400 watts an hour is what it's going to really take, or 500 watts an hour to run everything in the house that you absolutely got to run. So you go out and you buy a unit with 2,000 watt hours on it. You're going to use it 5 hours, and the power goes out for 7 hours. Guess what? That unit ain't going to last. Just do the math. If you're using 500 kilowatts an hour, 500 watts an hour, and you only have a 2,000 watt hour power bank, that's 4 hours. Probably a little less than that. You should go by the 80% rule. Whatever number you come up with for any figure to figure hours or how many watts or anything, always figure to the bad side of only 80%. So in other words, if going over that amount is bad, figure it at 120%. If going lower than that amount is what is bad to have happen, because you're using more power or less power, but you have less power left, figured minus 20%. But whatever your mark is, minus it or plus it by 20% to really get a more comfortable feel for what you're going to need. So I figured out that I'm using, and I'm going to use arbitrary numbers, but they're based on what I use for my own scenario. Because I have gas, natural gas for some of my appliances, my power bill consumption, my power consumption here is actually a lot less than a lot of homes out there. If you got all electric home, good luck at supplying power. But you really need to plan on having enough power to go 24 hours. If you're going to go with just a power station, you want that power station to last a full 24 hours. And we'll get into why that is as we go along here. Now keep in mind, when I say 24-hour period, if that figures out to 1,000 watts an hour, and that's 24 kilowatts of power in a 24-hour period, you probably should in reality figure that you really are only going to have 80% of that. You're going to use 20% more of that 24 kilowatt hours. But I'm not going to put that in. I'm just going to go by straight numbers just to make the math easier. You can understand what's going on here. And when you do your own figures for yourself, you can figure it out whether to add or subtract 20% to your number as you go along. So I have a house here that I want to power it for 24 hours when the power goes out, and be able to then, power comes back on, I can charge the unit back up. I got to know how many hours that I can run that, and based on how many watts I'm going to use per hour during that 24-hour period. And the reason you really want to do that is that way you know how big a unit you need, because two things are going to happen. You're going to run that thing out, and you're going to need to recharge it if you're going to be off grid, forced off grid for any length of time. You're going to have to replenish that power. So that's why it's a twofold thing to figure out a backup system for your house. And when I say, some people say, well, let's go with a generator, and other people say, well, let's go with a power bank, a power station. And in all reality, you really need those two items. Now, I see some people say go with solar and blah, blah, blah. I'm going to tell you right now, forget the solar. If power goes out, you got to get by until it comes back on. I would not depend on the solar as my source of replenishing my power. It's a very unreliable source of power. With the generator, you can be in complete control. The only thing you have to do is make sure you have enough gas to go over that period of time. So you want them both to work together in concert. And the best way to do that is, let's say, for example, let's talk about my example here. If I'm using 24 kilowatts a day, I have to be able to produce 24 kilowatts a day from a generator. Now, I can use a 5,000 watt generator and do it in just under 5 hours, or I can use a 2,000 watt or a 2,500 watt inverter and run the generator for 10 hours to generate that 25 kilowatt hours. But that's the key, is that you got to be able to replenish it, and you have to be able to do that reliably, not hoping that there's enough sun out there. So a generator and a power bank work pretty good together to give you that perpetual power. The only thing you have to continue to supply to it, and you have to go out and get, is gasoline. But you can calculate all that if you do it correctly. Let's take the generator for example. I got to do 24 kilowatt hours of power a day. And that would be, let's say, 5 hours a day I have to run it. Now, depending on the size of your generator, or the one you're going to buy, now you need to know how much gasoline that generator uses. If I'm going to just use an arbitrary figure of half a gallon. If it's a 5,000 or bigger, mine's a 7,000 watt generator, and it uses probably maybe 0.7 gallons per hour. instead. But there are some out there that are a little smaller and they might use 0.4. So I'm just going to use a 0.5 as a reference point because it's easier to do the math in my head. But if I have a generator that I'm going to generate 25 kilowatt hours, my generator, I can generate 5,000 an hour. That means I'm going to run it for 5 hours. Well, how much gas is that? You do the math. And now you're going to be using 2.5 gallons a day, in theory. And so that means that if you want 3 days of gasoline, you better be storing about 8 gallons of gasoline at all times. So you can go 3 days. That's how you have to kind of calculate how big a system you're going to need, how big a generator you're going to need, how big a power bank you need. Everything is based on what kind of consumption are you going to have if they take away your power. You want to power everything in your house and just let it run and not worry about it, and eventually it comes back on and things go well. Well, it doesn't always work out that way. So you really want to be in control of predict what you can and can't do, so that when you go out and buy that power bank or that power station, you want to make sure that you can run that thing for the period of time that you're going to run it versus when you're going to run the generator. And how much time a day do you need to run the generator? So you really have to have your math set up, and nobody talks about it, but you really got to understand how much power are you really going to use in that 24-hour period. That's why it's important, so that you can make sure you always have the power that you need as you go through multiple days. If it turns out to be multiple days, that you can perpetuate that power and bring it back. So most places just want to sell you that stuff. And like I said, solar, I would not even consider it. I think that a good match for a good off-grid system, emergency use, is you got to use both the power bank and the generator in concert. Now, as far as being efficient, that's why you want your power station. You want it, if you can, to be able to run, even if you're running the generator and charging it back up. So if you're going to buy a pre-rolled unit, like a Bluetti or an EcoFlow, you want to make sure that it has what is called pass-through charging, so that when you plug a generator into it, you can actually get the power to still come out of the unit while you're using it to charge. You could take and unplug the unit and plug everything into your generator, but that gets pretty complicated. So you really need that pass-through. Make sure that if you're not going to build your unit, you're just going to buy a pre-rolled one, make sure it does have pass-through charging, so that you can charge it while you're using that unit. And then while you're putting 24 kilowatts into that, you're still pulling in that 24-hour window out of that unit. So that way it continues constantly, and you're only running that generator for 5 hours a day. So instead of running it for 14 hours during the day, shutting it off at night and having no power, you can have power all the time. You can run that generator at its peak performance to get the most amount of watts out of it, and use that as your base of how using it efficient. And you can actually predict and actually use less gas than you would if you ran that generator all day. So a good power bank in use with the generator is a very good use. So I hope all this makes sense to you guys. It's something I've been thinking about, because like I said, nobody's really listening to the whole thing, but you really do have to have a good plan in place before you go. The way mine works now, I have a 20 kilowatt unit here. It puts out 6,000 volts or 6,000 watts at 240. I can plug it directly into the house. And then if I want to charge this while it's running the house, I have a charge inverter and I have a generator that I can plug this into the generator and power and charge this up while it's running the house. So I separate the two for being able to do the one in a time period that's good for it. So I can run that generator at its peak And that's really what you want to be able to do so that you get the most efficiency out of it. Rather than listening to it all day, I only have to listen to it about 5 hours a day, theoretically, based on those numbers. So you need to be able to do the same thing if you want. The only problem is there is a lot of money wrapped up between the generator and probably $1,000 to buy you a fairly good sized generator comparable to mine. You're going to need a charge inverter. That's going to be another $500. And you're going to need some kind of power station, a home backup system. Mine, I've got more money wrapped up in it than I should. If I went out and tried to do that now, I could do that for probably about $2,000 less than what I got into mine. It is what it is. But at this point, you could probably, around $5,000 will get you a unit comparable to what I have here from EG4. And so that means that I'm going to have $6,500 wrapped up in a home backup system. And you have to have a few other things, like I have a 15, a 13, 14, 15. I have a bigger gas tank, one of those roll-around ones. And I take it, fill it up, and so I have like 13 or 14 gallons of gasoline at all times here on the property. So that if I go down at 2.5 gallons a day, I can go 4 or 5 days. That gives me enough time to figure out, is the power going to be back on, or do I have to go find gasoline? And pre-plan to be able to do all those things without having any serious problems and having to rush to do it. So the system I have works pretty good. I can go for several days without ever having to leave the house. And if I had to leave the house, the only reason I would need to leave the house, theoretically, is just for gasoline. Everything else I am supplying myself through this system that I've set up. So, but again, like I said, that is a lot of money. There is ways to save money on this whole system. If you don't mind having to listen to the power of the generator, you could run a generator, a smaller one, let's say. I'm using 1,000 watts an hour. So if I take a generator, and let's figure out making the generator the main source of power, and we're going to use the battery system, the power station, only run it at night when I want the generator to be quiet. So I'm going to run the generator for 16 hours a day and run the battery pack for 8 hours through the nighttime, because there's going to be less power drawn during that time period. Instead of pulling 1,000 watts an hour, let's say I'm only pulling 300 watts an hour. So for 8 hours, instead of running 8,000 watts, I'm only going to be pulling 2,400 watts through that 8-hour period. That makes a big difference. So now, theoretically, I can run my gas generator in the morning and power everything. And then at night, I shut off the generator, I plug the battery power in, and I run everything at night, and it should last me till morning. So if you don't mind listening to a generator for 16 hours a day, you could get by with a much smaller generator and a much smaller power station to set up that kind of scenario. So you don't have to spend all this amount of money. For example, you can probably buy a 3,000 watt inverter and buy a power station that will give you, let's say, through the night. So you need a power station with about 3 kilowatt hours of power and about 1,800 watts of output. That should supply everything in my power, since I'm only running up to 1,000 watts normally. I should be able to run that generator, and then during the day, while it's running and running the house, I can also plug my power station into it and recharge it. And at the end of the 16 hours, I'm putting enough power to supply the house during the day and enough power to recharge the power station and use it at night. So that would be a much cheaper scenario, because now I'm only spending about $500 on a generator, and I'll probably spend another, let's say $2,000. Well, probably not even that, probably $1,500 for a much smaller unit, because now you're only going to need about 25 kilowatt hours of, excuse me, 2.5 kilowatt hours of power to run you through the night. So you're going to need a much smaller units, and you can get by, but you're going to use more gas, obviously, because now you're going to use a half a gallon of gas for 16 hours a day. You're going to use 8 gallons of gas a day instead of 5. So, but you're accomplishing the same thing. My big unit here is running everything, and I'm recharging it. Yours can also do the same thing, as long as the only difference between the two is you're using a little more gas, and you have that generator that you're listening to all day, but you got a lot less money wrapped up in your whole system than I have in mine. So there's a lot of ways you can go about this. Everything you do has to be based on your consumption. And that's the one thing I keep going back to, because you really, truly have to remember that your consumption is really what it's all about. Hey, that's enough. She loves to bark out there when somebody walks by on the street. So anyway, I wanted to give you my opinion about using a generator, a power bank, or both, and what is really the best way to set up if you're going into a forced off grid type of scenario. It's something I've been thinking about for a long time. I've actually got my system set up. It does work. Do I want to improve it? Yeah, I've got some things I want to do to improve it, and we'll talk about those things as time goes on. If you have any questions about any of that or what I've done here, I do have some past videos about it. If it's pretty simple, I'll answer it either by comment, or I'll actually make a video about it to answer your question, which I do many times from a lot of my questions I get from viewers. So anyway, tell me your thoughts. I'd love to hear what kind of system you got set up, and how, if you can go 24 hours or even more, can you perpetuate that for days if you had to? That's really what you want to do. How much power are you really going to use? These are the questions you really want to ask. Remember, I kind of relate. If you really get confused about watts and watt hours, you really need to understand that in your consumption of electricity. And consuming that electricity, it's kind of like a car, gasoline, and gas mileage. The watts, you would consider your miles per hour, and your watt hours is how much gas is in your gas tank, or how much gas can go in the gas tank. So watt hours is gallons of gas, and miles per hour is the wattage that you're consuming. And keeping that in mind, you should be able to figure out whether or not you can put together a system that will actually support you. So when that bad thing happens and you don't have that power, you're not going to be let out there high and dry and lose everything in your fridge, or not be able to stay there any longer because there's no power, and it's too cold for you to stay there. You do have to plan for that. And it gets more complicated than just electrical power sometimes. But at this point, that really gives you an idea. Most of the time, we just lose our electricity around here. I've never lost the gas around here. But anything's possible, I guess. And I do have some scenarios. So if my power goes out and my natural gas gets cut off, I could still get by. But that's for another day. At this point, this is how you want to get by between a generator, a power bank of some kind, and whether or not you should even use solar. Like I said, I think you now figured it out. You only need those 2 items for an emergency use. And I wouldn't even worry about having any kind of solar unless you find yourself going into a long term off-grid. In other words, like in some of the Helene areas that were hit, they may be without power for several months. Then I would probably go out and buy and expand my system. It'd probably be worthwhile to try to save on the amount of gas I'm using every day. But as long as I have access to gasoline, I can perpetuate and go for months if I have to. It's just a matter of how much it costs to do it. So anyway, that's my thoughts. I want to thank you for staying around this long. And if you did, I'm impressed. If you learned something here, you like this video, hit that like button. If you want to discuss this further, just let me know. I got plenty of things I can talk about this subject. But I really was thinking about this because I'm watching a lot of YouTube these days, more than I'm working, really. But I've been watching a lot of videos where they've been talking about how they've been going through this scenarios with the Helene and how they've survived through it and how they're surviving through it now. So when it comes to the power. And so I thought maybe I'd share you my thoughts on that. But when things go bad, you just got to do what you got to do. That's all I can say. I wish those guys luck. If I was younger and I could, I probably would run down there and help. But unfortunately, I cannot give that kind of help. But anyway, make sure you're prepared for that sort of thing wherever you live. And it's different everywhere. What I have here is a lot different than what you might have in Florida or in California or in Texas. So, and what your needs are would be more too. I worry more about having heat in the winter than air conditioning in the summer in an off-grid situation here. But in Texas, you probably want the other way around pretty much. Your heating demands would be easy to meet down there, but your air conditioning, which would be a must down there, I can get by without it. Down there, you wouldn't be able to. So everybody's different. You have to figure out your own. Just remember what to base it on, because it does make a difference. Listen, I want to thank you for stopping by. I would ramble forever, like I said, if I could. So make sure you hit that like button. And by the way, if you're new here, go ahead and subscribe, because as I always tell everybody, come back again, because I'm nowhere near done. Thanks, and we'll see you guys again very soon.